Hello and welcome to the quick start tutorial video for Thrive Architect. In this video, what we'll do is we'll build this page layout that you're looking at right here. And I encourage you to follow along and do this as well, because the purpose of this video is not to look at every single feature in Thrive Architect and look at every element, every option and so on. The purpose of building this layout is to get you familiar with the most things about Thrive Architect possible in the least amount of time possible. So once you've built this layout, you will know 90% of the things that you need to know to create almost any layout and almost any page you can think of. So with that, let's get started right away. Here we have a normal WordPress page loaded, and we can start adding content right here inside the content area of this WordPress site. But that's not what we're going to do. We are going to look at the first thing right away, which is overriding this page with a landing page made by Thrive Architect. So two things: you can click on this gear up here to get some options, and that includes template options. You can also go to the template options directly from this icon down here. And that's what we want. We're going to go to change landing page template. Here you will see, this is an early version I'm looking at here, so you will see many more sets of landing pages. We're interested in the blank page. So I choose that and load the template. So this is what we start with. As you can see, we have a completely blank page that overrides anything my theme has, headers, sidebars, and so on. So we have an absolutely blank canvas to work with. And let me start by, I'll click on paragraph text to add a text block here. And then I'll simply paste in some filler text like this. Now, as you can see, I can add elements by clicking on them and they go to the bottom of the list, or I can drag and drop elements. And this blue line that you see will indicate where the element will appear. So those are the two ways in which to add elements to the canvas. You can also see that I can hover over elements and I can duplicate them or I can delete them. You can also click onto an element when you have the green outline, that's the selected element, and that makes it a bit easier to hit delete and duplicate whenever you need to. So with this started, let me show you one more thing. I'm recording this here on a fairly small laptop screen. And what I really like to do and what I recommend you do if you're not looking at this on a full-size monitor is to zoom out. I do this by simply going Control minus, or I guess on a Mac that would be Command minus, and that zooms out in my browser. So I've zoomed out to 80%, and this makes it easier for me to get a feel of how the full page looks. It kind of compensates for the amount of space lost because of this sidebar here, which by the way, we can also collapse. And it also makes it easier for me to, have a better overview of all the options and elements here in the sidebar. So that's just a personal recommendation, to zoom out a little bit on small screens. So now one thing you'll notice is that the content is automatically restricted, right? It doesn't go full width, and it's restricted to 1080 pixels, so 1080 pixels. If we go into our page setup, we have landing page settings now. And here in the landing page options, you can see this setting. So you can change this. If you want this width to be less or more, you can change it. You can also make it run the entire screen width. However, usually you don't want that, right? We don't want text to just run as wide as the screen goes. So that's why by default, and I'll set it back here to 1080, this is how it's set up by default. But I just wanted to let you know that's where the setting is if you're looking for it. So that's in landing page settings. Here you can also change your fonts, your default fonts. And if you don't, it will just use the fonts that your theme loads. So with those basics out of the way, let's get started. So the first thing we want is, we want to have this background here. We want to have this image background. So that's what we need a background section for. I'll click on it again to add it at the bottom. And as the name implies, background sections is what you'll work with whenever you want a background for anything. So we select our background section, and then we have a bunch of options right here. And the ones that interest us, first of all, let's add a background color, okay? So if I add any kind of color here, it doesn't matter for the moment. I apply this, we can see we have a problem because it's constricted to this width, like the text. Of course, on a background, we often don't want that. So we hit this switch here, which makes it go full screen. We can also give it a minimum height right away. This is a minimum height because if you put more content in it, it will be taller than this, right? It will be as tall as it needs to be to fit the content, but you can set a minimum height where it's like it's never going to be less tall than this. Now we want a background image, of course, so let's do that. We go to the background style, and we've set a color, and we can now add an image by clicking here. We choose an image. This loads the WordPress Media Manager, and from here we can upload or choose existing images. So we choose that, and what we also need to do for the background image is set it to stretch. So we want it to stretch across the entire width. All right, so we apply that, and now let's get rid of the text here. Now let's start adding a heading in here. So I'll drop a heading inside my background section. And the next thing you'll see is this is automatically selected when I drop it. But if I click outside it, any text on the screen, you can click and edit immediately. And you can also go Control A to select all of the text in this block and then replace this with your own headline text. All right, then we have some inline options such as the alignment. So I'll make this center aligned. And we have a few other things. So the spacing, obviously we have a few problems here. First of all, we can't really read this text because of the background image. And also it's sticking to the top here, which doesn't look the way we want it to look. So what do? Let's start by making the text more readable. And what I'll do is I'll select the heading and I'll click in the breadcrumbs on the heading right here. Or I'll leave the cursor inside the heading without selecting any text. And I'll change the font color to white and apply that. So if I choose the heading here, or I have the cursor inside the block without selecting a word, then the color will apply to the entire block, okay? So with that, the next thing I want to do is I want this heading to be positioned differently inside the background section. And that's what layout and position are for. So I click on layout and position, and here I can add a top margin. So that adds space at the top of the heading. And the more space there is at the top of the heading, the further, the more it changes its position inside this background section. I can also manually enter something like 120. This is in pixels, right? So it's 120 pixels. This already looks better, but we still have a readability problem here. It's still very difficult to read this because of the background image. The best way to fix this is I'll click on the background section again, and we'll add another layer of background. So what you see here is this is our background color layer. Then we have an image layer, and on top of that we can stack more layers, and we can choose the order of those layers. So I'm going to add a color, and the most important thing here is the opacity of the color. So obviously if it's just black, then there's no point in having an image behind it, but I can make it semi-transparent, and that makes the text more readable. I can also give it a color of some kind, like this, and I can choose the color and the level of transparency that I want until I feel like this looks the way I want. And as you can see, basically the darker the overlay is, the better the text will pop out and be readable. So at something like this, I think we can be satisfied. So I'll apply that. Now let's also play around with this text a bit more. Again, I'll select the text block instead of selecting a specific word, and I can do things like change the font size. I can change the line height, and you can see this update live right here, and you can also do manual inputs. So if I want this to be 80, that's 80 pixels, I can change that manually. What I can also do is we can change the font. So by default, it will use the font that your theme loads. But you can change that. You can use web-safe fonts, which are fonts that will work on any computer and doesn't have to load any special font files or anything. Or you can choose Google Fonts, and here you can just search for any Google font, right? Like this. And then you can set font weights. So you can set how thick should the font be for normal text and for bolded text. So we'll go with something like this. And then we can apply that. We've got some other options, such as we can automatically capitalize all the letters like this. I'll make this a bit smaller again. And we can, in advanced options, we can do things like add text shadow, and we can change the letter spacing. Now, this reminder that just popped in is a save reminder. I haven't saved yet, and after 10 minutes, it will let you know you should probably save. You can save anytime by hitting this button here or hitting Control S, which I'm doing right now. So that does a quick save. All right, at this point we have all right, so one more thing about the headline. All of these changes now I've applied on the block level. So I've applied it to all the text in the heading. And of course you can also change individual words. So if I choose a word, I can change the color on that word. I can even change the font. And let's just change this to something like this. On an individual word, I can change the size on an individual word. And I can basically, all the changes we just looked at, I can apply to single words or the entire block. All right, let's move on to the next bit. So we've looked at backgrounds and text. Now the next bit is a content box. So background sections and content boxes are probably the two most important elements you'll work with for creating layouts. Background section is for this kind of background where you have a background behind everything that spans the whole width of the page often. And a content box is simply a box that has stuff in it. When I first add a content box, it's empty and there's just this little outline that lets me know it's there. This will disappear as soon as I put something inside it. So let's do that actually. Let's put some text in here and I will paste in some filler text again. Now right away, we've got two problems. First of all, we can see that we can't read this text properly. And also the content box has disappeared because now there's something inside it. Let's solve both of those problems. What I can do is, first of all, I can select all of this text and give it a different color. What I can also do, so let me show what that means. If I select this text, and let's say we make it red for it to be really obvious. If I now add another bit of text into this content box here, and I start typing here, you can see this text still has the default color. So if I continue writing on the red text, it will continue to be red. But if I add another bit of text, another text block, it will be default color again. So what I can do is I can actually change the text color on the block level. So I'll add another block here of filler text. And we can also see how can you, when you have stuff stacked into each other, if you have elements stacked on top of each other, how can you select the elements? That's what the breadcrumbs are for. So this shows us that the paragraph that I've selected is inside a content box, which I can select here. The content box is inside the background section, which I can select here. So you can always click on any element and then from the breadcrumbs, click on any element that it is inside of. If I go to my content box, I can go to the typography options and change the font color here. And I'm showing this because there's an important rule that you need to be aware of. On the block level of this content box, I'm saying that unless other rules are applied, make the text in this box white. And now this text, which is default text, and any new text I add into the box will be white, as you can see here. But this text remains red. Why is that? It's because inline changes, I've selected the whole thing, inline text changes override block level text changes. And that's important to realize, right? That's the difference between selecting directly, which will be the most specific rule, will basically override everything else, versus making block level rules on the paragraph or on the content box or even on the background section. You can make such rules. In other words, there's a hierarchy to the importance of which rule applies, right? If you say this content box in general should have white text, but this word specifically should be red, then that's how that works. All right, so let's clean this up a little bit. Let's go back to our content box and look at some more things there. On the content box, we want to have a background. Once again, I can set a background and I have all the same background options as I have for background sections, except stretching it to the full width of the screen. And let's make this transparent again, something like this, and apply. Now, another thing is, let's look more at spacing. So as you can see, the text here sticks almost exactly to the edges of this box, which doesn't look very nice. So let's select the content box and add padding. So we have margins and padding in layout and position right here. Okay, margin and padding. So the way this works is that margins are spaces applied at the outside of the element. So if I add a bottom margin, it adds space outside the box. And the same is true for top margin and side margins. And by the way, I'm clicking and dragging to change this, right? You can simply click on an arrow and then drag to quickly change this. And you can also do manual input. Padding, on the other hand, is on the inside. So here I can add space on the inside of the box, and that is the effect we're looking for right now. Now to make this easier, I'm going to link all the sides, and I'm going to add, let's say, 20 pixels, and that adds them on all sides like this. I'll unlink that again, and now we have a box that looks a bit more like an actual box, right? That has some space between it and its content. Next, let's keep working on this box. We've got borders and corners. Here we can add rounded edges, or rounded corners, I should say. And again, I can click and drag for this, or I can do a manual input. And I can also change this for individual corners. So if I choose these corners here, I can set them to 0. And then we have a box that has 2 rounded corners and 2 pointed corners. So that's, again, in borders and corners, you can either select all of them at the same time or select individual corners. And the same is true for your borders. So on the border, let's give it a white border. I can choose a color. I can choose a thickness of the border. I can choose dashed or dotted styles or solid. And I can also apply this to individual sides or to all sides. Next up, let's look at images and icons. So I can add an image, for example, inside here. This again will open the media manager from which I can select an image I want to use. From here, I can do things like change the image size. I can add a caption text to the image, which is inline editable, like any text. Basically, if you see text, that was a typo, but never mind. Any text you see, you can click on and edit directly on the screen. You can also change things like margins and padding. And you can also add borders and add rounding. Similarly, I'll remove this. You can do a similar thing with icons, and you can either search for the icons in here, find them here, or you can search for an element right here. So if I drop an icon, it has many of the same options, but here we have, these are totally scalable vector icons that we can use. And they're also searchable. I can insert an icon like this, and then I can do many things with it. So I can change the icon color, I can change the icon size. For example, and this applies to images, icons, and basically every other element. In your layout and position here, you can choose the alignment. So right now it's center aligned. I can do a left align and I can do a right align, and something a lot of people have asked us about, I can also make text wrap around this. So for that, I go into advanced options. And if it's left or right aligned, I can choose float, and that makes text wrap around it. So to demonstrate this a bit more clearly, let me remove the top and bottom margins here and paste in some more text. And here we can see this happening, right? The text actually wraps around like this. And the same is possible for the left alignment. In this case, we probably want to add a bit of margin to the side here. And that's how that works. And of course, center aligned, it doesn't work. You can't have text wrap around something center aligned, but left and right aligned, it works. Now, the other way to align things like this is to drag and drop something next to something else. So as you can see, I can drop this after the text, but I can also drop it next to the text. And this will create a column layout. And the column layout is resizable like this. And so the difference here is that here the text won't wrap, but it will be aligned to the side of the icon. So depending on which of these effects you want, whether you want to have a straight line of text down next to the icon, that's when you should use columns and drop items next to each other. Or if you want the text to wrap around, you should use alignment and the advanced float option that I showed before. All right, let's clean this up a little bit again. Inline text editing very quickly. I will move this to the top again. This gives me an empty column. I'll delete the column and then we're back to the layout we had before. On the icon, a few more things. I can add a background to this icon. As we've seen before, we can go like this, let's say. And for this to look nicer, I'm going to add inside padding, maybe like this. And then I can make a circle by just adding enough rounding like this. Next element is a button. So let's go to our elements, and this is one of our foundation elements, button, very often used. This is our button here. Text is inline editable, so this is my button text. And there are a few options on buttons. First of all, you can change the style. So you can change what a button looks like. We have some pre-made styles for you here. I want to show you how to customize it though, so I'll keep the default style. You can change the button size, so this will scale the entire button up and down. And you can also change individual elements such as the font size inside the button and all the other options we've looked at. Let me show you two things that are relevant to buttons. So the first is, let's select this, and here we can look at, first of all, let's add a bit of rounded corners as buttons often have. And then I want to show you borders and drop shadows, which can be used to achieve a more buttony look for your button. So I'll choose, first of all, let's get this color here. I'll grab this color and I will choose the bottom border, and I will make it a darker shade of this, maybe like this. And I'll make it larger, there we go, but not that large. So I want it to be, let's say 2 pixels or so. That gives it a bit of a 3D kind of effect. I think this is actually too dark for the effect to be visible. 3 pixels, or maybe something like that. That gives it a bit of a kind of a button effect. And another thing we can do obviously is we can add a shadow. So let's do that next. I'll go to shadow, add a drop shadow. We can choose a shade. So this, I'll usually use black and just make it transparent. And we can choose an angle. In this case, I want it to be 170, pointing straight downwards. We can choose the distance of the shadow. We can choose the size of the blur, and we can choose a spread. So the spread is usually best at 0. And then, yeah, we can just play around with the blur and distance and all that until it looks decent. So now we've got a pretty eye-catching button, which needs one more thing. It needs a hover effect. So if I click on the button again, you have the state here. I'll click on from default to hover. Now I can choose what this button will look like when the mouse cursor hovers over it. And the typical thing to do here would be, let's say, to make it a bit brighter. So I'll just make the button color a bit brighter. I'll leave everything else the same. And now we've got a button with a hover effect. This brings us to the final stretches of building our layout. There's a bit more fiddling we can do, of course, with spacing. Again, remember, padding is inside the box and margin is outside the box, like this. And there are a few things we can do. So to kind of remember this layout here, we want to get 2 boxes that look very similar next to each other. So to do this, there's several ways to do this. One thing to do is to get a column layout, add it here, and select 2 columns like this, and then move my content box into the first one, and then duplicate it and move it into the second one. That's one thing to do. As we saw before, I'm going to move this out again, and I'm going to get rid of the columns. As we saw before, another thing we can do, so we can use duplicate to simply get a duplicate of this box, and I can drag the second box next to the first one. That creates the exact same thing. This is also a column layout with 2 columns. So that is the exact same effect. One more thing I want to show is we can select this content box, and we can go to Style and Templates and save this template. Let's call it white icon box. Save that. Now I have this as a reusable element that I can also use on other landing pages and in other content. So if I go to my content templates, I drop that in here and I search for white icon box. This also gives me a replica, an exact replica of this box. I can then make some small changes, like choosing a different icon here, changing the background color to something else, and so on. And that's how I get something like the layout we originally looked at. Now, another thing is, if I select one of these boxes, I can, again, for columns, this is pretty important. I can choose the column that this is inside and make changes to this individual column. I can also choose the column's container and make changes there, such as defining the gutter width. That is the width of the space in between columns. Okay, so that's another setting we can change here. And as a final thing, one more thing on the button, I want to show you the animations and actions. So for a button click, you can do things like make it open an image or open a video. So if you simply have a YouTube video that you want to pop up in a modal window when someone clicks on this text, that's something you can do in animations and actions. You can add tooltips on hover. You can animate it into view. You can make the button appear with an animation. And you can do things like open light boxes on click. So these kinds of things are all inside animations and actions. So whenever you want something to happen, when someone clicks on a link or a button or a box or something like that, animations and actions is where you should go. Once you have built your page like this in the workflow, what you'll usually do is you'll build the page first until it looks like you want, and then you will go to the responsive view where you can see what it looks like on different screen sizes. So this is a smaller tablet-like screen, and we can make changes here. And then this is a phone screen, and we can make changes here. Now what you can do is you can choose any element, and on the block level, on the style level, you can make changes that only apply to the selected screen size. So let me show you what that means. If I go to the tablet view, let's say, and I have this heading selected, I can make the text size smaller. And as you can see, it works for everything except this word that we resized separately. So again, the block level changes are overridden by the inline changes. We can change this, and this will now mean that on the desktop, we still have very large text. On tablet, we have smaller text. And on the phone, we also have smaller text. So any change you make on tablet will also apply to phone. I can now make it still smaller for the phone screen, and I can change the spacing, for example. That's also a style change. And this only applies to the phone screen. So the medium screen is the way I left it before. The large screen is unchanged. So style changes you make will cascade down to smaller screens, but not up to larger screens. Any inline change you make, like this, will appear on every screen. Okay, there's no way to do this without it applying to all screens. Only style changes in the sidebar will be device size specific. But that means we can do things like, we can choose this, we can change the icon size, we can change margins, paddings, text size. You can do many, many changes that will only apply to a specific screen size. So that is the modifying, responsive modifying of properties, of style properties, which is very useful. Another thing you can do, and the second way you can use this, if we go back to the full view here, second way you can use this, let's say we have this icon and we duplicate it, and let's make a different icon here with a different background. And what we'll do is we will go to the responsive menu and we'll say this here is invisible or is hidden on desktops and hidden on tablets. And this one here is visible on desktop and tablet, but hidden on mobile. Okay, so I have two icons here and they're hidden on different screen sizes. So now if I go to the mobile view, we still have this icon. And if I go to the phone view, this icon is basically replaced with the other one, because again, this one is hidden on the larger screens, the other one is hidden on the small screen. So those are the two ways in which you can totally change your layout and your content and your styles for any mobile device and any screen size. So with that, as you've seen, we haven't looked at every single element and every option in Thrive Architect, but with this, if you can replicate this page based on these instructions, you can do almost anything already with Thrive Architect. And with a little bit of trial and error and playing around, or by watching our other more specific tutorials, you will soon be a masterful user of Thrive Architect.